In this third video on Unitarian Universalist history, I'm going to talk about my own interests and researches. I want to be clear at the start that I'm not a trained historian, so I don't use standard historiography. For my methodology, I rely both on what Robert Coles called doing documentary work and on insights from the field of practical theology, especially that subfield of practical theology known as religious education. This means I'm less interested in intellectual history or history that traces the careers of ministers or history that traces the careers of famous or nearly famous people. I'm more interested in learning how ordinary people interact with our religion. I'm going to start off by talking about my master's thesis. Actually, I can't call it a master's thesis. We weren't allowed to write a thesis when I was at Meadville-Lombard Theological School. I always suspected it was because the faculty didn't want to read a whole bunch of tiresome 100-page theses. So the things we wrote were called integrative papers. I'll call mine a thesis even so, for even though it was only 25 pages, the research I put into it was the work you'd put into a standard master's thesis. What I wanted to do in my thesis was to research how children and teens experience a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Rather than studying one age cohort, I decided to look at children in one congregation over a 50-year span. I was interested in seeing if perceptions of children and teens changed over time. I was able to gain access to a willing congregation and started by researching their archives for documents that might shed light on how children and teens experienced their congregation. Then I sent out a call asking for people who had grown up in the congregation who were willing to be interviewed by me. In my interviews, I was guided by Robert Coles's book, Doing Documentary Work, and also I was guided by Religious Education Theory and Praxis. I learned, not surprisingly, that the primary experience of children and teens was not the intellectual content of religious education curriculums or sermons. Instead, children tended to have vivid memories of experiences, fantasies, and of other people. One of my informants had vivid memories of singing in a children's choir, and this person went home and set up their toys in an imaginary choir that they then directed. Another person vividly remembered an adult teacher leading a guided meditation in which the children were invited to imagine that they were rose bushes, and my informants said that for a moment they felt that they really were a rose bush. One teen wrote about their powerful experiences with their peers, and these were a few memories that I uncovered from informants as I did my research. But there were not many memories of formal theology, in fact, none that I recall. I also learned that this congregation had been shaped by 3 separate instances of sexual misconduct by clergy persons. Although none of my informants were abused by clergy, almost all of the sexual misconduct was between adults. Nevertheless, subsequent to the clergy misconduct, I felt in the history of that congregation I could identify a difference in the way children and teens related to the congregation. Since then, I have confronted in several congregations the way that clergy's sexual misconduct, or indeed sexual misconduct by anyone in a position of power in the congregation, can have subtle but lasting and pernicious effects on the people and relationships in that congregation. Since my thesis, I've done quite a bit of research in this area. None of this research will probably ever be published or made public, and here's why. Because the individual congregation has to be in charge of when and how clergy sexual misconduct is talked about. This is an ethical issue. If an outsider starts talking about how thus and such a minister in thus and such a congregation was having sex with members of the congregation, it can split the current day, the present day congregation. So it's the members and the ministers of the congregation that have to bring these dirty little secrets to light. And because of this, I wound up asking that my master's thesis go into a locked vault in the Meadville-Lombard archives until such a time as the congregation I studied chose to confront its history of clergy misconduct, and as far as I know, that's where it still is. However, I can, as an example, talk about sexual misconduct in our congregation, because I'm in this congregation. Ethically, I can do this. So there are persistent and credible allegations that Bill Jacobson, minister of this congregation from the mid-1970s to 1990, slept with a number of women in the congregation. Although such behavior was tolerated to some extent in those days, feminist theory has shown us clearly how clergy sleeping with their congregants are abusing their clerical power. We have also learned from psychotherapists of the emotional damage that can be done to the women involved and to the wider congregation. It is also alleged that Bill Jacobson engaged in domestic violence against his wife. They divorced a few years into his ministry in our congregation, and there are also isolated allegations that Jacobson may have had sexual contact with persons under 18, though it must be remembered that the age of consent laws in California have changed since those days, and it is not clear that he engaged in illegal activity based on the laws of his day. So those who study clergy sexual misconduct have identified several common ways congregations respond to such misconduct. And I'll focus on one. Congregations may develop a culture of secrecy. If a minister engages in sexual misconduct, and if that misconduct is not revealed in an appropriate way to the congregation, then there will be some people who know what really happened, and there will be other people who are not clear what's going on. In my observation, this can lead to a congregational culture where open conflict is avoided, because once you start talking about difficult topics, some people will worry that someone is going to talk about the big secret of sexual misconduct. This leads to another result of clergy sexual misconduct, a congregational culture where it is difficult or impossible to have productive, healthy conflict. Since by some estimates approximately 2/3 of all Unitarian Universalist congregations have experienced clergy sexual misconduct recently enough to affect their congregational culture, I trust you can see the implications of all this for Unitarian Universalist history. And before you start thinking about how horrible religion is, remember that sexual misconduct by men or by persons in power happens everywhere in a patriarchal society, including government, schools, the workplace, military, etc. One thing the Me Too movement has shown us is how widespread sexual misconduct is. So, what are the historical implications for all of this? Well, first of all, there are a great many untold stories of the women, for it is mostly women, not entirely, who are victims of clergy sexual misconduct. There are a great many untold stories of these women who've been victimized by clergy. Second of all, given the prevalence of clergy misconduct, it makes you wonder about all those rosy historical portraits of influential male ministers. And indeed, a recent biography of Forrest Church, perhaps the best-known Unitarian Universalist minister of the late 20th century, this biography revealed that he had, in fact, engaged in sexual misconduct. How many other of our ministerial heroes engaged in the same kind of conduct? A third implication for denominational history or religious history: looking at history from this angle makes me see congregations in a new light. I've often wondered why congregations have been so intolerant of healthy conflict over, for example, race and racism. And I've come to believe that many congregations cannot tolerate the healthy conflict that will inevitably arise when confronting racism, because those congregations have a culture of secrecy that has roots in clergy misconduct. Thus, for our own congregation, I don't expect us to make much more progress in addressing racism in our congregation until we more adequately confront our culture of secrecy that has its roots in Bill Jacobson's alleged misconduct. Only until we do that work can we expect to have a congregational culture that will tolerate healthy and open conflict. When you realize that there are allegations of sexual misconduct by one or two past presidents of the Unitarian Universalist Association, or UUA, I believe this helps us understand the wider picture of denominational history, why the UUA as a whole has had such a hard time dealing with the conflict that comes with confronting racism. I don't even know if the allegations of sexual misconduct by UUA presidents is true or not. But until we remove the veil of secrecy and talk openly about the allegations that are floating around, I believe the denomination is going to have a hard time dealing with any major conflict, let alone dealing with the conflicts that arise when doing anti-racism work. So now I think it should become more clear why I categorize what I do, not as history, but as practical theology. Yes, I am looking at history and historical facts, but my concern with history is how it affects the practical workings of our congregations here and now. I'm primarily concerned with how children and teens experience our congregation, and a culture of secrecy is not healthy for kids. Take, for example, the critical social and emotional developmental stage that occurs in early adolescence, when young people are trying to find their identity. This is a developmental stage when young people turn from their parents to look at other adults as potential role models for their identity formation. A congregation can provide a good pool of potential role models for early adolescents if that congregation does not have a culture of secrecy, and if that congregation holds its members and participants to reasonable standards of personal and sexual conduct. By contrast, a congregation that has been damaged by unrevealed clergy sexual misconduct will tend to have a culture of secrecy that can, for example, allow sexual harassment to go unchallenged, and that can allow adults who engage in questionable conduct to come into close contact with early adolescents. What often happens in such congregations, in my observation at least, is that the people charged with running the programs for children and teens isolate those programs from the rest of the congregation because they want to keep the kids safe. While this may be a good interim solution to keep kids safe, no one, including the kids, actually really feels safe. So all of this poses a distinct challenge to the consensus view of Unitarian Universalist history. When Unitarian Universalist history is reduced to the history of Unitarian and Universalist theology, stretching back to the early Christian era, we can easily lose sight of how today's children are experiencing our religious communities, or about how children in any age or any era experience their congregations. When Unitarian Universalist history is reduced to valorizing mostly white male ministers, we may ignore the ethical lapses of those men. Similarly, even when Unitarian Universalist history is expanded to include women ministers and non-white ministers, we are missing the experiences of the majority of Unitarian Universalists who are not ministers and not famous enough yet to have important stories to tell.